Stangibelisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1GV Whiskey 1 Golf Victor, located in the Black Hills of South Dakota. My ham radio equipment you can see right behind me there, and a little more over there. That screen, by the way, is a Great Images in NASA download of dark matter. There's a laboratory here called the Deep Underground Science and Engineering Laboratory, or the Sanford Lab, or the Sanford Underground Research Facility. You'll find a link to it on my website at sciencewriter.net. But what I'm interested in doing here is describing for you another one of the little tricks I played when I was a kid living at my parents' house in Rochester, Minnesota. Another one of those things that confounds Murphy no end. Murphy's Nemesis, version 3.0, 2 ground rods fed like an antenna, a quarter wavelength apart and a quarter wavelength out of phase. What do you suppose will happen if you do that? I wondered, and I found out. And Murphy found out too. You know, one of the coolest things about ham radio is the way that things that shouldn't work, or maybe theoretically can't work, will. And sometimes they'll work in ways that you never would have imagined. And this is one of the best examples I can ever give you in that respect. This I did when I was maybe, 20 or 21 years old. I was in college at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and I would periodically come home to my parents' house in Rochester, Minnesota, and they had a backyard with terraced retaining walls, multi-level backyard, kind of a neat place. And good soil, excellent soil for ground rods. So I got it into my head, I wonder what would happen if I fed 2 ground rods spaced a quarter wavelength apart, a quarter wavelength out of phase with each other. So I pounded 2 8-foot ground rods into my parents' backyard. They were real good about that sort of stuff. I think maybe they thought I was smart or something. I guess the joke was on them. 1 ground rod here. Now here in this direction, north was like that. So I had 1 ground rod on the east side, 1 ground rod on the west side, and I spaced them apart 1/4 of a wavelength. And I believe that the frequency I used was 14 megahertz. So lambda over 4, like that, taking a velocity factor of the ground into account. Now, I don't know what the velocity factor of the ground is, but I assumed that it was somewhere on the order of velocity factor somewhere on the order of 80%. So you would take a quarter wavelength, which is about 16 feet, or 17 feet in free space on the 20-meter amateur band, multiply that by 0.8, and that was the distance here, about 15 feet maybe. Oh yeah, about 15 feet apart. Okay, got that? Here's the west ground rod, here's the east ground rod. Then I fed them with lengths of coaxial cable. And what I did was I ran the center conductors of that cable right to the ground rods. Another cable like this, center conductor right to the ground rod, and the braid or the shield of the cable was simply left free. Then I connected those 2 cables together with a so-called coaxial T connector where you can hitch two PL259s up to each other like this. So in effect, what I had then was shielded cables going like this and like this. The trick is that I wanted to make one of these branches of this line a quarter of a wavelength longer than the other one, and I used solid dielectric RG8U, which has a velocity factor of something on the order of 66%, I believe. Anyway, I calculated that, and then I fed this one a quarter of a wavelength ahead of that one, so that what would happen is that supposedly I would get directional effects, that in one direction these signals, or the signals, right, coming out of here would add together. So I made it so that they would add together going towards the east, a phased array of ground rods. And going towards the west, contrary-wise, they would cancel each other. So supposedly, I would get a cardioid pattern that would look something like this, that being the point of the antenna. This is the antenna, a ground rod antenna. If you look at it on a polar plot, you'd get a cardioid, you'd get a null going that way and a peak going that way. Well, then I listened on the air and compared the reception that I got with this concoction with my 20-meter ground plane antenna on the roof of my parents' house. And I found, of course, that the signals were all much weaker on this ground rod antenna system. But the directional characteristics were not only like this, like a cardioid like this, but they were vastly more pronounced. They seemed tremendously pronounced. There were signals that I could hear on this antenna very well that I couldn't even hear at all on the vertical because of other signals interfering. And contrary-wise, of course, there were signals I heard on the vertical that I couldn't even hear on this. Well, of course, I had to test that and find out, do a little bit of testing and find out where those stations were, and that's exactly what I seemed to get. But it wasn't just a matter of a few decibels of gain, it was something like 30 decibels of front to back ratio. Now, I couldn't believe it. I thought this was crazy. This was crazy. A front to back ratio of 30 decibels? That's what you'd expect to get with like a dish antenna, like the one they have in Puerto Rico at that observatory, that radio telescope or something. Except, of course, the signals were very, very weak because, after all, I was listening on ground rods. My call sign at that time was WA0 Ocean Kilo Victor in Rochester, Minnesota, and I got it into my head that I would transmit into that thing and see whether I could make any contacts, and I did. I contacted a W5 in New Mexico, which would have been kind of skew off the back of that antenna, but I contacted him anyway. He didn't give me much of a signal report, but hey, what I was in effect using was, what I in effect did was I made a QSO on a dummy load. Murphy, take that. Murphy, and Murphy, don't screw up my spelling. You're making fun of me now. Who gets the last laugh? I have no clue. Stan Gibilisco, signing off, saying 73 and So long.